A Premiership West Coast Eagle is heading to North Melbourne. Jack Darling will be spending the final few years of his football career at Arden Street. But what does the move for Jack Darling to North Melbourne really mean? How big of a win for this football club that has spent the better part of a decade towards the bottom of the ladder? How important is this? For the Eagles, who are new to the bottom of the ladder over the past few years, does this help them ascend up the AFL table? And importantly, for AFL Fantasy, SuperCoach DreamTeam and Keeper coaches, what does it mean for us in 2025 and beyond? Jack Darling, a little bit of a maligned player early days in his career, was slammed a little bit for not really turning up in big games, including that failed West Coast Eagles grand final loss just a little more than a handful of years ago now. But he certainly changed that narrative. He had a pretty good premiership game and premiership season. And we know that Jack Darling, at his best, is a really, really handy forward. Now, granted, at his age, we can't expect him to be what he has been, but for North Melbourne, this could be a really handy inclusion. We'll look at what it means for the Eagles in a moment, but for North Melbourne, this adds some great depth for them, some great leadership, some great experience, all things that they have been looking to bring in because they're not exactly lacking in elite young talent. Now, it's maybe more through the midfield and the back line that they've got that, but they have had plenty and will again in 2024 have access to some high-end draft talent. But what the inclusion of Jack Darling does is it enables a couple of things. One, some better forward structure and support for a forward line that's really been entirely dependent on Zurhaar and Larkey to perform and kick their goals. If neither of those two boys get them there, well, they're not impacting the scoreboard. So Darling coming in, while not a key position in terms of a chuck it on top of his head, watch him take a contested mark. Although he can do that, it's his work rate in and around the ground that gets him into positions to be able to take marks, get pressure on the opposition defenders. And that's one of the things that North Melbourne love about him too, is his ability to add some defensive tackles, some pressures, and to lock that ball inside forward 50 and not just rely exclusively on their smalls to get it done. So Darling enables that hugely for them. Some support, some wisdom, some structure alongside Zurhaar and Larkey. It also means for North Melbourne that should they wish to, Charlie Comben can go back and take a key pillar defensive role. He looked fine in front of the ball, and he's certainly a handy utility that can play at either end of the ground. But by going and getting Darling, clearly that means to me they want to send Comben back, structure up that back line just that little bit further. And for the next year or two, Darling can play some pressure forward, some lead-up presence, take some marks, kick some goals, take some pressure off a Zurhaar and Larkey forward line. So for North Melbourne, they wanted some forward wisdom, they wanted some forward experience, and they wanted another avenue to goal. Darling gives them that. From a West Coast Eagles perspective, well, Darling was just becoming a part of the past for them. They have made it really clear what they want their key position forwards to look like over the next 5 to 8 years. It's a Waterman forward line. It's an Allen forward line. And when not having to play full-time ruck, which he has for the better part of 2 seasons now, a Bailey Williams playing that ruck forward role, a Matty Flynn spending a little bit more time as the full-time ruck. And with those 3 guys as their core tall forwards, Williams, Waterman, and Allen, there's just no need for a Jack Darling through there. It gets the salary off the books. It gives them even more for Mini Magualta, just the reset they need to be absolutely all systems in on this rebuild and to just build around the guys that they should be, which is Allen, Waterman, and to a lesser extent, Bailey Williams as their forward tall. So to me, a great move for them because it just means they are fully committed to the future. It probably doesn't hurt their goal scoring impact too much because Waterman and Allen are clearly the guys that they have over the past year or so been committed to. Darling's just been a little bit of cream on top. And for a team that hasn't seen the ball inside forward 50 a whole lot, it's understandable that he hasn't been able to impact near his best. So for West Coast, great forward motion for North Melbourne. It just gives them that little bit of extra buffer and support while they hope to finally get out of the bottom four in 2025. From a fantasy footy perspective, what does it mean for us? Look, he's a guy that's got some tons in his, not just his history long term, but even last year there were some 100+ scores that he can get. So certainly he can still impact the scoreboard. But like any tall forward and key position forward, the avenue to scoring is through marks and through goals. And yes, he'll probably get the third best forward stopper or the third best defender, whereas previously he's got the second, some games, depending on West Coast health and fitness, the number one. So he'll certainly get a little bit more freedom than maybe he's had ever in his AFL career. But it's still going to be a challenge for North Melbourne getting that team up to a competitive space to give him the volume and the quality of inside forward 50 entries to make him anywhere near relevant for us in drafts. Because in Classic, while he's got some histories as a 70s guy in AFL Fantasy and an 80s guy in SuperCoach, that is him and West Coast at their absolute premiership winning peak. And contending for premierships is as good as he's ever been. And so it would be crazy for us to think a team that's coming off multiple bottom 2, bottom 4 finishes, that he could be anything more than what he was at the Eagles premiership contending best. So the best case scenario is in drafts. He is a very, 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 have I said the word very yet? Very late selection, depending on the depth of your draft. And more often than not, he's not going to get picked up on draft day at all. Depending on the matchup, he could be a decent waiver wire plug and play option on the right week-to-week matchup. But to me, there's just no reason to consider him as a salary cap or a classic format of any of the games relevant at all. Like I said, it is deep drafts, long drafts. Okay, maybe there's a little bit of late reason to pick him up, but politely, it is a plug and play. Wait for the right opponent, and other than that, you're just not touching Jack Darling. But do you agree or disagree? If you're watching this on YouTube, comment below and let me know your thoughts about what Jack Darling's going to do for the North Melbourne Football Club and how this could help West Coast Eagles fully commit even more to this rebuild. If you're listening to this episode as an audio podcast, thank you so much for doing so. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already where you're listening to this platform podcast, you can go and do that and give it a 5-star rating and even a nice review if you like. We are dropping videos and audio podcasts on every single player that moves clubs. If you want to keep in touch with us across social media and have a conversation about these players, you can do so with the details of where you can follow us across social media in Instagram, Facebook, X, TikTok, YouTube, the works. It is all there in the description of this episode. And also the details to become a part of our Patreon, where you get exclusive content, including our Keep Up ranks that are dropping every single week at the moment. All the details for that are in the description of this episode. Well, the trade period is away. We've got some movement now with players getting traded. Every single free agency and trade that goes down, we will review it and tell you what it means for fantasy footy in 2025.